Hi, I'm Brent Russell, and welcome to It's Biblical. Today we're going to be talking about how to serve others and what Jesus said about that. And I think you might be a little surprised at what he said. You see, actually, let's just jump right into it. We're going to go in, I'm going to read out of Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Jesus says, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." So, Jesus is telling us here to avoid doing something just to get praise. Back then, the Pharisees used to come in and they would have banners waving and blowing trumpets just so everybody could see what they were doing and giving. And Jesus says, no, don't even let your left hand know what the right hand is doing, to give in secret. And then he tells a story about the Good Samaritan. You see, one day Jesus was in Jerusalem, and a scribe comes up to him and asks him a question. Now, a scribe is somebody who's pretty high on the Jewish spiritual chain. And at this time, they had been following Jesus around and asking him questions and trying to trick him so that they can find a way to throw him into prison and eventually kill him. So the scribe comes up to Jesus and he asks him this question. He says, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus kind of turns this question around on him and he says, "You've read the scriptures." He says, "How do you read it?" And the scribe says to him, he says, "We should love the Lord with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and we should love our neighbor as ourselves." And Jesus says, "That's correct. If you do those things, that you will have eternal life." But then the scribe asks him another question to try to trick him. He says to him, "Well, just who is our neighbor?" And Jesus tells him the story of the Good Samaritan. And this is what he says to him. Jesus says, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, they beat him, and they went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came by the place and saw him, passed on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took two denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any expense that you may have.'" Now, I'm going to stop right here for just a minute to explain, bring you up to speed on this. Okay. You see, Jesus specifically mentions in here a Levite and a priest, because you see, a priest in those days would have been the highest in the Jewish chain, and then a Levite would have been just under that. So Jesus tells him, there's a priest and a Levite come along, and they see this guy who's been robbed and is laying there half dead. And all they do is they just walk on the other side of the road and just go right past him and don't do anything. He says, Then a Good Samaritan comes along. And now what you want to understand about a Good Samaritan is, back then in the Jewish religion, a Good Samaritan was nothing. A Levite and a priest, they would have spit on a Good Samaritan. They thought that they were the dirt, the bottom of the chain. You see, Good Samaritans were half-breeds. They were half Hebrew, half Egyptian. They were Gentiles, and the Jewish community looked down on the Samaritans. So Jesus is telling them, he says, two guys from your Jewish organization, higher up than you are, a priest and a Levite, come along and see this guy laying there half dead and just walks by and does nothing about it. But then a Samaritan comes along, a guy that you would spit on. He stops and helps him. He bandages his wounds. He puts him on his donkey. He takes him to the hotel, and he sets him up there in a room. He says the next day, he pays for him, and even says the next time I come through, if it costs more money, I'll pay that too. And then he goes on his way. And he does all of this without asking for any recognition. So, then Jesus looks at the scribe, and he says to him, he says, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? Well, the scribe knew the answer, and he had to give the right answer. And he says to Jesus, the one who had mercy on him. And then Jesus looks him right in the eyes. And with 4 simple words, he shuts him up completely. He says to him, go and do likewise. You see, I love what the Good Samaritan did in this story. He came along and he saw a need, and he went into action and he just did it. He didn't do it for recognition or even to let anybody know what he did. As a matter of fact, we don't even know what this guy's name is. We just refer to him as the Good Samaritan. And here it is 2,000 years later, and we're still talking about him. That's what Jesus is talking about, giving, and not letting the left hand know what the right hand is doing. Just to give out of your heart and to help somebody, because that's what Christians do. Because God loved us. Because God loved us so much that he gave his only son to die for us on the cross. So we should love others like that. I think it's interesting to note here that when the robbers came along, their attitude was, what's yours is mine. And they robbed from this guy and took what he had. Then when the Levite and the priest came along, their attitude was, what's mine is mine. And they didn't even help the guy at all. Then when the Good Samaritan came along, his attitude was, what's mine is yours. And he helped him without even asking for anything in return. That is how we show love to others. That is how we serve. And when we do that, we earn rewards in heaven. Thank you for listening. God bless you. And remember, it's biblical.